Hi, welcome back to the next video snippet from the video novel, The President and The Cockroach. If you've been watching the news for the last couple of years, you ought to be reading this book. That's all I'm saying. You should read it now. I'll put a link near this video so that you can purchase it from Amazon.com in ebook or paperback, whichever you prefer. But you need to read this book because you don't know anything until you've read this book. I'm just saying. Okay. So let's begin. Here's the beginning of chapter 4. This is called The Previous President Takes a Powder. Before Hillary F. Beans ascended to the lofty heights of the presidency, there was, of course, another president. You know his name. Been living in a cave with dial-up, but his name is not important. This erstwhile executive eventually determined that discretion is the better part of valor, although his ruinous reign did inflict innumerable injuries to the republic's body politic, as well as to the politics of and many of the bodies of those who resided in said republic. And as everyone, including that president, knows, the best kind of discretion is found in countries with no extradition treaties. The quondam head of state realized that continuing in his elected position would eventually cause problems for him and probably place him in an untenable position, most likely the kind with bars on the windows. So he began searching for a means of making tracks and a location to skedaddle to. The former leader, while he possessed many properties, needed a hideaway. If he had decided to run to the weekend White House, even though the walls around the mansion were 12 feet tall, he would still have been in plain sight and easily accessible to both law enforcement and those who wished to return certain favors to him, personally and extra-legally. If he had chosen to flee to his wife's house in the Big Apple, it would have been much the same. If he had resolved to fly to one of his many resort properties, even if he could have managed to squeeze under any of the many beds he would have found in them, he would still have been much too easy for those people who would be looking for him to find. And after he had left, found was the one thing he did not want to be. So the question presented itself. Where could he go and disappear, at least until the calls to welcome him back outnumbered those to lock him up? Such a decampment would come with its own set of caveats. First of all, he would have to find a country without an extradition treaty with the United States, or one willing to ignore that kind of treaty for the right encouragement. Secondly, absconding would place him at the mercy of his new host, possibly becoming a pawn in a larger game. This left out North Korea, China, Cuba, and Russia, who might be traded back in chains to the land of the free for certain concessions. Thirdly, disappearing could place him in the sights of an armed drone. American Predator drones had been doing their jobs pretty damn effectively for the past decade or so, so that deadly efficiency eliminated the Middle East, Central Asia, almost all of the many stands, and the northern two-thirds of the African continent. If he was not blown into tiny bloody pieces by a bolt from the blue, any one of a number of governmental acronyms could always kidnap him and return him to the U.S. or one of its numerous domestic secret prisons, CSPs, HSUs, CMUs, or Homan Squares, where there exists no record of their guests, or to one of its extraterritorial black sites without his host government's consent or possibly knowledge. That concern eliminated the little countries with and without emirs, on the western coast of the Persian Gulf, a couple of pleasant little nations that touch the heavens in the Himalayas, and a few of the larger island states. Some places were active war zones, and of lands who were not actively warring, a number possessed entirely too many machetes and car-truck bombs. A few, the Maldives, Samoa, Cape Verde, and Micronesia, were little palm-treed St. Helenas, certainly not places for his most august public servant, by the grace of God and the Constitution of the Republic, ex-President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Executor, Enforcer of the Laws, Protector of the Pacific and Atlantic Island Territories and several Commonwealths, CEO of 1,000 resorts, to cool his heels. A few locations without extradition were simply laughable. The Vatican. The Pope had on numerous occasions tweeted his contempt for the USA's prior CEO. Mongolia, the very thoughts of fermented horse milk and living in a yurt were disgusting and laughable. And Myanmar, he was relatively certain that any denial of human rights only happened to people without much money. And hey, Didn't Myanmar used to be fucking Burma? Most importantly, some countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Iceland, Nicaragua, Switzerland, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, despite having treaties with the United States, have refused U.S. extradition requests. He had vacationed in Switzerland, great chocolate, stopped briefly in Iceland to see the northern lights, and had read that Ecuador was a great retirement destination, inexpensive with excellent health care. He wouldn't be required to buy insurance. Regardless of the place he chose for his retirement, the ex-pres would need a couple of new passports and more than a few bank accounts, unassailable by the U.S. government. The government would be sure to cancel his passport and confiscate the American bank accounts he knew about. He had anticipated that decades ago, moving almost all of his money offshore. FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, signed into law by that Kenyan, had put the screws to anyone interested in keeping some money out of the sight of the IRS and its minions. Unfortunately, the soon-to-be ex-executive of executives had not been able to convince those whorish grifters in the House to put FACTA repeal first on its calendar. Since those dunces in Congress screwed that pooch, if he wanted to escape FATCA snooping, that would mean banking in Russia or China, snort, and even Switzerland, that had kept zillions of Nazi dollars on the down low for decades, for Christ's sake, had finally knelt to the international arm twisting of the Americans, well, some of the Americans, as had the Caymans. This meant that he would still have to buy citizenship, or 2 or 3, somewhere, which currently ran about $300K in St. Kitts and Nevis, and a little less in Croatia, and convert a lot of money into something easily spendable. Art, emeralds, gold, platinum, diamonds.